So the Shiur tonight is dedicated to Ilui Nishmas, Reb Shmuel ben Pinchas, and the Yortzeit is actually today, Ches Shvat. Reb Shmuel was a very dear friend and a wonderful person and an Ohev Torah, and we had a relationship for many, many years. Whenever he came to Eretz Yisrael, he always came to visit me in Ramot, and he was a participant in the Shiurim I gave. And I don't know which Yortzeit it is, but the second Yortzeit. And the Torah we are learning today should be Le'ilui Nishmoso Reb Shmuel ben Pinchas. And I also dedicate the Shiur to Hatzloches, my grandson, Yonis Benyamin ben Reza, was getting married tomorrow night. So tomorrow night there will be no Shiur in Har Nof. And you're all invited to the Chasana. It is in Modi'in Eilit. So when I invite a public crowd to a chasana, I won't say the address. If you really want to come, then you'll go inquire and to find out where it is in Modi'in Eilit, in Kriat Sefer. So tomorrow night, Baruch Hashem, is a big day for our family, a chasana, and we all daven. Shazil Galo Yofer, it should be a binyan a day ad, and we should always share B'Sayis Tovis, and we should share Nachas. So the sugya we will be learning today, and it's Parshas Beshalach Shira, but I always prefer and I try to look for sugyas that are relevant, that are part of our daily avodah. So the sugya we will be learning today is Krias HaTorah. And the source of Krias HaTorah is this week's parsha. That's the Gemara in Bava Kama Pei Beis Amud Aleph. Right after Shira Sayam, the Pusik says, Vayasem Moshe's b'nei Yisrael miyam suf, v'yetzu al midbar shur, v'yelchu shloishes yomim b'midbar, v'lo motzu mayim. V'yavomer also, v'lo yochel shloishes mayim amora ki mora meim, al ken koresh mayim mora. So the Gemara says in Bava Kama Pei Beis Amud Aleph, lo motzu mayim, ein mayim ela Torah. They went 3 days without Torah, and everything was falling apart. Amdu neviim shebeinehem v'tiknu. Shiu koyrim b'Torah b'Shabbos, and then they skip Sunday. Koyrim b'Torah yom sheni. They skip Tuesday, Wednesday. Thursday, once again, Krias HaTorah. They skip Friday. Shelo yelchu shloisha yomim b'li Torah. So the Gemara says, neviim shebeinehem, in the days of Yetzias Mitzrayim. This happened right after Yetzias Mitzrayim. Nevi'im shebeneim tiknu shelo yelchu shloisha yomim b'li Torah. And that is the Gemara in Bava Kama Pei Beis Amud Aleph. Rashba, not the Rashba, but the Rambam, and I'm happy that the Svarim are on my table, even though I didn't give Mara Mekoimis, but somebody's on top of things here. And Perik Yud Gimel Aloha Aleph is the dinam of Krias HaTorah. Perek Yud Beis, not Perek Yud Gimel. Perek Yud Beis Aloch Aleph. Moshe Rabbeinu tikel lem liyisrael sheyeh koydem b'Torah b'Rabim, b'Shabbos, b'Sheni u'v'Chamishi b'Shachris, kedei shelo yishu shloisha yomim v'lo shmias Torah. Ve'ezra tiken sheyeh koydem b'Mincha b'chol Shabbos v'Shabbos mishum yoish v'Kronis. V'gam hu tiken sheyeh koydem b'Shem v'Chamishi shloisha b'nei Yodam. And that is based on the Gemara Bava Kama Pei Beis Amud Aleph, as I mentioned. So the Prima Godim at the beginning of Hilchos Krias HaTorah, and Kuf Lamed Hey, the Prima Godim wonders, did they ever go Shloisha Yomim B'li Torah? I mean, Krias Shema Shachris V'Arvis is Torah twice in Shas, Nedorim Ches Amud Aleph. Once again, Menochas Tzadik Tesem Edveis. The Gemara says, "Afilu loy korei lekriya shema shachas v'avos kiyem. He is mekayim the mitzvah v'lo yom sefer haTorah zeh mepicho v'hu gisu bo yomam v'layla." So what about kriya shema? And the Prima Godim says that he offers 2 different terutzim, and both seem to be a big doichak. That the takana was she koydem b'Torah metoichak sav. Kriya shema doesn't need to be b'toichak sav. You could recite Kriya Shema Bar Peh, but Krias HaTorah necessitates reading Metoich Zav, and that was the takana of Moshe Rabbeinu. But why would it make such a big difference? Shelo yelchu gimel yomim beli Torah. Why would it make a difference how you learn Torah, Meterach Zav, or by heart? The other teretz is, well, Kriya Shema is Kriya, and you're yoytze the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, but Lasoik b'divrei Torah is different. But Lasoik b'divrei Torah, according to the Taz Simon Mem Zayim, means iyun, means learning. Krias Torah is no different than Krias Shema. Both are Kriya, so it's hard to understand what does the Prima Godim have in mind when he says, Yoytze Krias Shema, but not Eisek HaTorah. Neither is Krias HaTorah Eisek HaTorah, and Krias HaTorah is so similar to Krias Shema. Both are just reciting psukim from Torah. I think the answer is so simple, and it's obvious, Matorch Divrei Rambam. And I think if I'll read this halacha again, everybody will notice what the takon of Krias HaTorah was. Moshe Rabbeinu tikel lem liyisol shiur koyrim b'Torah berabim b'Shabbos b'Sheni u'v'chamishi. That makes the difference. It's Talmud Torah berabim. Because Krias Shema, everybody recites on his own, and he has a span of hours of Krias Shema, Shachas, and Avis. Talmud Torah berabim, that the people, the nation, together should be engaged in Talmud Torah, and that was the inyan of Halachic Gimel Yomam Beli Torah, and that makes all the difference. And I think that's Pshat in the Gemara, and it is clear in the Rambam. Moshe Tikkan Yison Shiur Koyrim B'Torah B'Rabim B'Shabbos V'Chem Shemizi Kedei Shelo Yishu Shloisho Yomim Beli Torah. Is Krias Torah min Torah or min Rabbanan? And first of all, there seems to be a machlokes Bavli and Yerushalmi, and some matter of confusion even according to the Bavli. So we started off with the Bavli, and that is the Gemara, Daf Pei Beis and Mesechet Bava Kama. V'yerchu shlosh yomim b'li mayim. And Chazal's interpretation is, mayim is Torah in mayim el Torah. There were 3 days. V'neviim shebeneim tiknu, shelo yerchu shlosh yomim b'li Torah. And we stress from the Rambam, the point is Talmud Torah B'Rabim. The Yerushalmi, Perek Dalet Halacha Aleph Mesechet Megillah, and that is a Megillah, Chavtas Amud Aleph. In my forum, I always quote the Yerushalmi on the Daf, and that goes back 40 years or somewhat more since I started publishing Sforim, because I always learned Yerushalmi Vilna. But today, Ois V'Hodar is a new game, and everybody switched over to Ois V'Hodar. There are different dapim. I can't go now and change all the Manamakoymis, the hundreds of sources I quoted the Yerushalmi in 35 volumes. So, but usually I also quote the Perek and the Halacha. So it's Megillah Perek Dalet Halacha Aleph. Chavtas Amud Aleph from Tfuz Vilna. Moshe Tikkan Lena Yisol Shiur Koyrim B'Torah Shabbos, Yom Tov, Rosh Chodesh, and Chol HaMoyed. That's what the Yerushalmi says. Ezra Tikkan Shiur B'Torah B'Sheni V'Chamishi. So that is different than what we learn in the Bavli. In the Bavli we learn that not Moshe Rabbeinu, but rather Neviim Shebeinehem, they were Metaken Shelo Yerchu Shlosh Yomim B'li Torah. But the Yerushalmi says Moshe was Metaken Krias Torah Shabbos, Yom Tov, Rosh Chodesh, and Chol HaMoed, Mikroei Kodesh, and Ezra was Metaken Sheni V'Chamishi. We just learned the Rambam. The Rambam says Moshe Tikkan Lehem Yisrael, but in Bavli, the source I quoted in Bava Kama, Neviim Shebeineim Tiknu, and not Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Kesef Mishnah on this spot says, who are the Neviim? Well, this was during the lifetime of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu took them out of Mitzrayim. He brought them up to the gates of Eretz Yisrael 40 years later. So who are the Neviim? The Neviim of that generation were all the Talmidim of Moshe Rabbeinu. They were the Beis of Moshe Rabbeinu. So Moshe Rabbeinu, together with the Neviim Shebeneim, it was a decision of Moshe Rabbeinu and Shivim Zikainim and the Neviim. So the Kesef Mishnah writes, if Neviim Shebeneim during the lifetime of Moshe Rabbeinu made a takana, that is actually a takana of Moshe Rabbeinu. Nobody would do anything in that generation without the support and the encouragement and the consent of Moshe Rabbeinu. So there is no stira between what the Rambam writes Moshe Rabbeinu taken and what the Gemara says Neviim Shebeneim. Moshe Rabbeinu was Aval Nevi'im. So he was the greatest Navi, and other Nevi'im were all his Talmidim, and they were metaken this takana. But the Yerushalmi seems to have a totally different approach. The Yerushalmi says Shabbos is different than Sheni v'Chamishi. Sheni v'Chamishi is Ezra Sofer. Shabbos is Moshe Rabbeinu. The Gemara in Bava Kama says Moshe Rabbeinu Tikkun or Nevi'im Shebeneim, which means Moshe Rabbeinu, according to the Rambam, Sheni, Chamishi, and Shabbos. What did Ezra metaken? We just learned it in the Rambam. Ezra was metaken Asora Psukim and Gimel Kruim. So the Gemara says in Bava Kama, Ad Ezra Sofer, they learned Sheni v'Chamishi. But only one person was Oila Torah, and all they needed to read is 3 psukim. They could be mad of 3 people, and everybody has one pasuk, or one person to read 3 psukim. And Ezra Sofer was metaken, Asora psukim and Gimel Kruim. So that Yerushalmi is Perek Daled Aloch Aleph. There's another Yerushalmi, Perek Aleph Aloch Aleph, in the same Masechet, in Masechet Megillah. So the first Mishnah of Megillah says, Megillah in a case, Yud Gimel, Yud Dalet, Tezvov, Tezayin, B'nei HaKforim Magdimim L'yoyim HaKnisa. And that is a special takana for B'nei HaKforim. The people that live in little towns and little hamlets, and they come into the big city, the Krias HaTorah. So Chachamim were metaken a special takana that B'nei HaKforim Magdimim L'yoyim HaKnisa. B'nei HaKforim, obviously, they had no Sefer Torah. Echod be'ir, Shnayim b'mishpocha, they had no Sefer Torah. They neither had anybody to read the Megillah for them, and they're coming in anyway, Sheni v'Chamishi, so let them read the Megillah b'Sheni v'Chamishi. That's what the Mishnah says in the beginning of Masechet Megillah. And the Yerushalmi asks a question. But Ezra Sofer was matakan the Kriya, Sheni v'Chamishi, and Mordechai v'Esther were many years before Ezra Sofer. The story of Shushan Abira was between Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni. Ezra Sofer was at the beginning of Bayis Sheni, so Mordechai and Esther were before Ezra Sofer. So in the days of Mordechai and Esther, there was no Yom HaKnisa. Yom HaKnisa is only when Ezra Sofer was metakan Krias HaTorah Sheni v'Chamishi. So the Yerushalmi once again seems clearly to go to Shitosoi. Ezra Sofer was metakan Sheni v'Chamishi, not like the Bavli that Moshe Rabbeinu and Aviyim Shebeneim were metaken Krias HaTorah Sheni v'Chamishi. The Rashba and the Ritva both deal with this question in Masechet Megillah, and they both explain. Moshe Rabbeinu tikkun Krias HaTorah b'Sheni v'Chamishi. But in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, people didn't take it seriously enough. It was just one person was Oila, and he read 3 psukim, or 3 people, and each had one pasuk. It was only in the days of Ezra Sofer, when he was matakan Asura Psukim and Gimel Kruim, that it became choshuv in the eyes of the people. And actually people came together for Krias HaTorah. And that's why the Yerushalmi asks, until the days of Ezra Sofer, there was no Yom HaKnisa. So they did read, but Ezra Sofer gave more meaning and more significance and more importance to the takana of Krias HaTorah Sheni v'Chamishi. That is the explanation of the Rashba and the Ritva. Fundamentally, there is a machlokes Bavli and Yerushalmi. The Bavli here says Moshe Rabbeinu or the Nevi'im shebizmanu were metaken Krias HaTorah Sheni Chamishi v'Shabbos kedei shelo yelchu gimel yomim b'li Torah. And the Yerushalmi says Moshe Rabbeinu was metaken Shabbos Yom Tov, Rosh Chodesh Chol HaMoed, Sheni v'Chamishi, and Mincha b'Shabbos. That's the takana of Ezra HaSofer. So how do we define Krias HaTorah? Is it a mitzvah d'oraisa or a mitzvah d'Rabbanan? The first question is, a takana of Moshe Rabbeinu, so that mean it's min HaTorah or maybe not? Moshe kibel Torah Sinai. And only what Moshe was a makabel from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that is min HaTorah. But Moshe was the first and the greatest teacher of Torah ever to live. And Moshe was also metaken tekanos. And one of the tekanos of Moshe Rabbeinu was Krias HaTorah. So the fact that it is Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't mean that it's min HaTorah. However, the Bach in Siman Kuf Lamed Hey does say Krias HaTorah is min HaTorah because it's Moshe Rabbeinu. And this is a fundamental chiddush. I don't recall asking for a tour. I usually ask for the Mishnah Berurah, for the Rambam. Does anybody know where the tour is? And that's the last chelik in Orach Chaim Siman Tov Reish Pei Hey. I would like to recheck the Bach that I've seen many years ago. And the Bach says the mere fact that it's Moshe Rabbeinu, that into itself means that it's a min HaTorah, because Moshe Kibbutz Torah Sinai. But all the others maintain Moshe Rabbeinu was metakan tekonos, like other Chachmi Yisrael that were all metakan tekonos, and the tekonos of Moshe Rabbeinu are midarabanan and not min HaTorah. So the Bach, Siman Tov Reish Pei Hey. So the Bach brings Tosfos, very well-known Tosfos we spoke about many times. Brochas Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. Tosfos says that the only kriya that's min HaTorah is Pasha Zachar, V'chedoima. So the Shulchan Aruch writes twice, Kuf Mem Vav in Hilchas Kriyas HaTorah, Tov Reish Pei Hey, Dinei Daled Parshiyos, that Parsha Zochar and Parsha Porah are min HaTorah. Parsha Zochar, well, yes, Zochar is Hashos HaLachamorek. Why would Parsha Porah be min HaTorah? We'll discuss that at another time. It's not really relevant to the Shiur, but Tosfos clearly says, Kriyas HaTorah is midrabanan. It is only Parsha Zochar and maybe Parsha Porah that are min HaTorah. And the Bach comments in Siman Tov Reish Pei Hey. Ma shetovsem HaTosfos b'pshitus, the Kriyas HaTorah eino min HaTorah, ele midrabanan ve'ezra hu shetiken ikal t'moya. Because the Gemara Bava Kama says, Moshe Rabbeinu olav v'sholom tiken b'midbar sheyeh koydem b'Torah. And therefore, the Bach says, Kriyas HaTorah and Shabbos should be min HaTorah. Lefi zeh vaday, kol kriya b'Shabbosos min HaTorah. So the Bach is mavliya two arguments. One is Moshe Rabbeinu, but the other is a more powerful argument, and that is the Yerushalmi says, how do we know Moshe Rabbeinu tiken Kriyas HaTorah Shabbos, Yom Tov, Chol HaMoed, Vayedaber Moshe Moyad Hashem el b'nei Yisrael. So the Yerushalmi's pshat, the Yerushalmi's interpretation of this pasuk, Vayedaber Moshe Moyad Hashem el b'nei Yisrael, means Kriyas HaTorah. And it's not only a takon of Moshe Rabbeinu, it is actually a pasuk in the Torah. And Moshe Rabbeinu was metaken, and he was mefarish, based on the pasuk, Vayedaber Moshe Moyad Hashem el b'nei Yisrael. So the Bach maintains that Kriyas HaTorah Shabbos Yom Tov, whatever the takon of Moshe Rabbeinu, is min HaTorah. And that is primarily based on the Yerushalmi that darshans the pasuk, Vayedaber Moshe Moyad Hashem el b'nei Yisrael, that meaning Kriyas HaTorah. We quoted Tosfos and the Shulchan Aruch. Brochas Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, twice in Shulchan Aruch, Parsha Zochar, Parsha Porah is min HaTorah. So, according to the Shulchan Aruch, it is obvious that other kriyas are only midrabanan. So, Ad Kan, our first part of today's Shiur, what is the source of Kriyas HaTorah? Who is matan Kriyas HaTorah? Is it min HaTorah and then it's chomer? Is it midrabanan? Question number 2 is it chayves hayochid or chayves hatzibur? Is Kriyas HaTorah upon every individual, or is Kriyas HaTorah chayves hatzibur? Tefillah is definitely chayves hayochid. According to the Rambam, Tefillah is a mitzvah d'oraisa, and that is v'avadatem es Hashem Elokechem. Ez avodah b'shelev zu tefillah. So Tefillah is definitely a chayves hayochid. Tefillah hatzibur eino nidches. Tefillah b'tzibur is gula. It is important. But the mitzvahs of Tefillah rests upon every individual. How about Kriyas HaTorah? Is Kriyas HaTorah chayves hayochid or chayves hatzibur? There is no kriya, only if you have a minyan. But that doesn't mean that it's not chayves hayochid. Maybe every individual is responsible to have a minyan, to go to a minyan. So how do we define the mitzvah of Krias HaTorah? Obviously, it's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, even though the Bach argues it's min HaTorah, but the Pashtus, as they quote it from the Shulchan Aruch, Pashtus Uch is min HaTorah, but Krias HaTorah is a takana. According to the Bavli, Nevi'im shebeneim. According to Yerushalmi, Moshe. But it's midrabanan. And probably, Vayidaba Moshe's Moedim Shem al Bnei Yisrael would be an asmachta and not a mitzvah diuraisa. But regardless whether it's Torah midrabanan, is it Chovis HaYochid or Chovis HaTzibur? Rabbi Yosef Engel, in one of his amazing Sforim, and all his Sforim are amazing, and he wrote many Sforim. Each of them has a different name, and you need to be a bookie and a genius just to remember the names of all his Sforim. I also wrote a lot of Sforim up to now. There are about 35 volumes. But I was concerned that my elderly years, I won't even remember the names of my Sforim, and that's why I decided to give them all the same name. So all my Sforim are Minchas Osher, so I'm confident that at least I will remember what Sforim I wrote. So the Beis Avenger wrote many Sforim, and each has a different name. Tziyunim l'Torah Semintes, there's a huge discussion dealing with a slightly different question. Krias HaTorah, is Chovis Kriya or Chovis Shemiya? Is every individual mechuyev in Krias HaTorah? However, one is moitzi all the others, Shemeya Ka'ina. Or maybe the chiyuv of Krias HaTorah is not Kriya, but rather Shemiya. Like, for an example, Shofar. The broch is Lishmoya Koyal Shofar. The mitzvah of Megillas Esther is definitely Kriya, because we say Berchas HaMitzvah, Ala Mikro Megillah. So could we prove what is the mitzvah of Berchas HaTorah from the Nusach HaBrocha? No. For some reason, there is no Berchas HaMitzvah. So we don't say Asher Kedishonu b'mitzvos v'tzivonu either Lishmoya Krias HaTorah or Al Krias HaTorah. And that is a different question. Why is there no Berchas HaMitzvah and Krias HaTorah? We will discuss that in a few minutes. So Rabbi Yosef Engel discusses, is the mitzvah Kriya or Shemiya? But the more fundamental question is it Chovis HaYochid or Chovis HaTzibur? If it's Chovis HaTzibur, then the mitzvah cannot be Kriya, because not everybody lanes. If it's Chovis HaTzibur, then everybody needs to participate, and it would go without saying the mitzvah is Shemiya. But it's a Chovis HaYochid, maybe the Chovis Kriya, but you can't lane unless you have a minyan. So there are many sources that would indicate that the mitzvah of Krias HaTorah is upon the tzibur, not upon the yochid. Soita Lametes Amud Aleph, Elu Nikroim. And inside of this is an entire perek, what things need to be said in Lashon Kodesh, and what things could be said in any Lashon. And Lametes Amud Aleph, Masechet Soita, the Gemara says, Misho Tziyah Sefer Torah, no one is allowed to learn, and all have to listen to Sefer Torah. And many Rishonim, on the spot, primarily in Brochas Daf Ches Amud Aleph, that's the opinion of Tosfos, the Rosh, Perek Aleph Halacha Zayin in Brochas, and the Tunas Mekuf Memvov quotes Rashi, there is a to learn while Krias HaTorah is said, is only if you learn out loud. But Balachash, you could learn. And the two quotes Alochas Gedolos. If there are 10 people listening, it's not a Brocha Levatollah, and the others could learn quietly, Balachash, not out loud. If it would be Chovis HaYochid, everybody needs to listen. If it's Chovis HaTzibur, it would be sufficient. 10 people, you have a minyan, listening to Krias HaTorah, the others could learn. And this opinion, this shitta, would have no explanation unless we say it's a Chovis HaYochid. Shibolei Aleket, one of the Rishonim in Siman Lametes, Tameya, and he wonders, how could you learn? You have a chiyuv of Krias HaTorah. So how could you learn while they're laning? The opinion of Shibolei Aleket is it's a Chovis HaYochid. You need a minyan to enable you. But the chayv is upon each individual. So how could you learn while they're laning? And all those Rishonim and Poskim that say, if there are 10 people listening, all the others could learn Balachash, they must assume that it's Chovis HaTzibur. And if you have 10 people, then the Tzibur is Yotzei Dechavosai, and it's not upon the Yochid. The Beshalach at the end of Siman Kuf Lamed Hey, Siman Kuf Lamed Hey, the very fast Sif, I think it's Sif Yud Daled. We are not metaltal at Torah, a Sefer Torah for people that are in jail, that are incarcerated, and that is Kuf Lamed Hey, the last Sif, which is Sif Yud Daled. Bnei Odom achavushim bebeis ha'asurim ein meviim etzlem sefer Torah afilu b'Rosh Hashanah v'yom HaKippurim. We're not metaltal sefer Torah, mishum koi the Torah, for people not even Hashanah Yom Kippur. Mishnah Berurah and Beshalach say, but if there's a minyan out there, you are metaltal sefer Torah. And the Beshalach explains, if there's a minyan, they're mechuyev. And if they're mechuyev in kriat, then it's justified to be metaltal sefer Torah. They should be able to read. So what does the Shulchan Aruch mean when the halacha is bnei udem achavushim bebeis asurim ein meviim etzlem sefer Torah? Are they individuals? An individual doesn't lay in any way. There is no kriat Torah for an individual. And it is not the days of the early Tanoim in which they don't need a Sefer Torah to learn. You don't learn from a Sefer Torah. So obviously, Pshat in the Shulchan Aruch is, B'nei Odom achavushim bebeis ha'asurim, it is not justified to bring a minyan and a Sefer Torah out there. You can't read kriat Torah without a minyan. The Havamina would be Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Let's go visit them and bring along a minyan, and they should be able to hear kriat Torah. Shulchan Aruch says no, because an individual has no chiyuv of kriat Torah. But if there is a minyan out there, I don't know whether we should be proud about this or not, but in many prisons in America and Israel, many minyanim. Some places it's like shtiblach, like Zichron Moshe. So we have a very respectable community out there. So the Beshalach explains, if there's a minyan bebeis ha'asurim, we will take a Sefer Torah to them because they're mechuyev. But if it's an individual, he has no chiyuv. So we won't make the effort to bring a Sefer Torah and a few additional people, they should be able to learn. So this opinion once again would prove that kriat Torah is a choives hatzibur and not a choives hayochid. I think that is probably the opinion of most sources. However, every tzibur is composed of yechidim. So I think if you are part of a tzibur, then the choives hatzibur becomes a choives hayochid. Because if everybody would say, I'm not mechuyev, then who is mechuyev? So the more relevant question would be, does a yochid need to make a huge effort if he's not going to daven with minyan? Does he need to make an effort to go to hear kriat Torah? Because you could daven b'yechidus, but you can't learn b'yechidus. And therefore, if you're weak, if you're ill, if for some reason it is hard for you to go to minyan, then you could have it at home. But if kriat Torah is a choives hayochid, then sheni v'chamishi, you need to make an effort to go to shul because you're going to lose your mitzvah of kriat Torah. But if kriat Torah is a choives hatzibur and you're davening at home, you don't need to go to shul in order to hear kriat Torah. But if you are in shul, you're part of the tzibur. And if it's a choives hatzibur, that means you as well. And that is the machlokes and the rishonim, whether if you're in shul and there are 10 people listening, whether you can learn on your own. And we also find in Halach and Shulchan Aruch that even according to the opinions that you're not entitled to learn, but you could say Shnayim Mikro ve'echad Targum, even though you're not saying together with the tzibur that's learning. So this opinion feels Shnayim Mikro ve'echad Targum is somewhat the equivalent of kriat Torah. I'm not learning Ktsois HaChoshen, I'm not learning Mishnah Berurah, I'm not learning Gemara. So this is somewhat similar to the mitzvah of Krias HaTorah. So even those opinions that feel you're not allowed to learn, even Balachash, but you could say Shnai Mikam Echad Argim. And this halacha, once again, would prove it's not Chovis HaYochid, it's Chovis HaTzibur. So what I'm trying to explain is, if you are in Shiur, it definitely is the right thing to listen to Krias HaTorah. If you're davening at home for any reason, and you have a good reason to daven at home, you're part of from Krias HaTorah, but it's a Chovis HaTzibur, not a Chovis HaYochid. But if you are in Shiur, you're part of that tzibur. And therefore, you should be listening to Krias HaTorah and not doing other things. And that is a machlokes rishonim, as I explained. And then the other question I mentioned before.
Some people who are in Chutz La'aretz, in Eretz Yisrael, and they miss one of the laning of the week. So according to if it's Chovis HaTzibur, you wouldn't have to go try to catch up with it.
Right. If it's Chovis HaTzibur, then he has no chiyuv to try to look for a minyan and to catch up. If it's a Chovis HaYochid, yes, that is another halacha that is mitlitaria, that is dependent on the two different approaches, and I'm happy that you mentioned that. And the other question would be Chovis Kriya or Chovis Shemiya. All the other Kriyas are Chovis HaKriya. Tefillah is a choiva on the individual, Mikro Megillah. The Nusach HaBrocha is al Mikro Megillah. But as I explained, we don't have Berachas HaMitzvah and Krias HaTorah. And therefore, it's the question, is Krias HaTorah. So if it's a choiva HaTzibur, I think it goes without saying that it's a choiva Shmiya. Because if each and every one needs to learn on his own, that goes against the assumption it's a choiva HaTzibur. However, if it's a choiva HaYochid, then the question would be, Lishmoya, like Shofar. Shofar is also Chovis HaYochid, and the mitzvah is Lishmoya called Shofar. Or would it be Chovis HaKriya? So by Shofar, the mitzvah is Lishmoya called Shofar. And I think we spoke about mitzvah Shofar more than once throughout the years. And I brought the Ritva at the end of Masechet Rosh Hashanah, which is an amazing Ritva. And the Ritva says, how do we know that mitzvah shoy is l'shmoya? Because in the Torah, we find neither a lashon kriya nor a lashon shmiya. All we have in the Torah is yom, trua, yiyah, lochem. And it says, because the essence of mitzvah shofar is tshuva. Uri yeshenim shenaschem, v'nerdomem akitzum etar damaschem. Therefore, we know that the mitzvah is shmiya. And what's so special about this ritva is, obviously, everybody remembers the Rambam, and I myself quoted the Rambam hundreds of times. In Perek Gimel Melech Shiur, the Rambam writes, "Afal pishet ki yesh shoifer b'Rosh Hashanah gzeres hakosev remez yesh ba. Kaloi mar uri yeshenim shenaschem nerdom hamakitzum etatzam zichro berechem chipsum hamasechem chizu b'tshuva." But I always make a point of explaining that Rambam doesn't write this halacha in Hilchos Shofar; it's in Hilchos Tshuva. So this Rambam is a Musa Shmus, and not really a Psak Halacha. But the Ritva takes the Rambam out of Hilchos Tshuva, and he puts him into Hilchos Shofar. And the Ritva says, the only reason the Nusach HaBrocha is L'shmoya Kol Shofar, and how do we know that the essence of Mitzvah Shofar is Shmiya and not Tkiyah, is because Shofar is all about Tshuva. And that is fascinating. So if that is the reason shofar is l'shmoya, would that apply to Krias HaTorah? Krias HaTorah, do we have any reason to say that it's more mistav than mitzvah shmiya than kriya? Only if it's Chovis HaTzibur. If it's Chovis HaYochid, probably it would be kriya. And this brings us to the last question in today's shiur. Why is there no birchas HaMitzvah and Krias HaTorah? Whether it's a mitzvah d'oraisa or even a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, there's berachas a mitzvah and many, many mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. Mikra Megillah is d'Rabbanan, we say. Netilas Yadayim is d'Rabbanan. There are so many mitzvahs d'Rabbanan lulav called shiva is the Rabbanon b'Medina, and we say Berchas mitzvah and every mitzvah, not only mitzvah d'oraisa. So why is there no Berchas mitzvah krias HaTorah? The answer is there is never two different brachas on one mitzvah. And like mitzvahs Kriyas Shema, Chazal were metaken Berchas Kriyas Shema, there is no Berchas mitzvah. Kriyas Shema, Shachas V'Avis is a mitzvah d'oraisa. So why don't we say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kedeshonu b'mitzvot v'tzivonu al Kriyas Shema, or Lekro Es Hashema, because we have Berchas Kriyas Shema, and Berchas Kriyas Shema is also instead of Berchas HaMitzvah. And it's the same with Berchas HaTorah. Because Chazal were metakam, Asher Bocha Bonu V'Kol U'amim for Kriyas HaTorah, there is no Berchas HaMitzvah. Then why do we find two different brachas on Adlukas Ner Chanukah? Why don't we say the same by Ner Chanukah? Why two brachas? There are no two brachas on Adlukas Ner Chanukah. Shosem Nirsem Lavaseinu was on the Yoim. Haroya Ner Chanukah is not Makayim the mitzvah of Adluka, but he still says the bracha Shosem Nirsem Lavaseinu. Therefore, on Adlukas Ner Chanukah, there are no two brachas. There are only one bracha. But never do we find two different brachas of two different natures on the same mitzvah. And in that aspect, Kriyas HaTorah would be like Kriyas Shema. Kriyas Shema is a mitzvah d'oraisa, and we don't say Berchas HaMitzvah because we have Berchas Kriyas Shema. Same regarding Kriyas HaTorah. We don't say Berchas HaMitzvah because we have the Bracha Rishona, which is Berchas HaTorah, which is Asher Bocha Bonu Mikol U'amim. So today we discussed the mitzvah that we are Makayim on a steady basis, 3 times every week, more than 3 times every week, 4 times every week, Sheni, Chamishi, Shabbos Shachris, Shachris Mincha, Yomim Tovim, Yemei HaTanis, and in many different occasions. Moitze Lechem and says Berchas Hanenin. It's not on the mitzvah. And Moitze Lechem and you say all the 7 days of Pesach and all the 365 days of the entire year. But there are never two brachas on a mitzvah. But it is on Krias HaTorah. We say it every day in the morning, but it's a bracha on the mitzvah of Kriyas HaTorah. Berchas Kriyas Shema is also not Berchas HaMitzvah. Berchas Kriyas Shema are also Berchas HaShevach, but nevertheless, there is no Berchas HaMitzvah. So it would go to the same for Kriyas HaTorah.
We say Berchas HaTorah in the morning for all the Torah that we're learning the whole day. So why are we saying another bracha for the Torah?
The other bracha is on Kriyas HaTorah. Shtei tshuvas bedover. There are 2 answers to your question. One is based on the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says that the mitzvah d'oraisa of Berchas HaTorah is only Talmud Torah berabim. Talmud Torah b'yochid, there is no mitzvah d'oraisa, only a mitzvah d'rabanan. And the basis of the Yerushalmi is, from which posik do we learn the mitzvah of Berchas HaTorah? Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klal Yisrael, Ki Shem Hashem Ekro Havu Goydel Lelokeinu. And that was Moshe Rabbeinu teaching Torah to the entire nation. So according to Yerushalmi, Berchas HaTorah is only berabim. And that is why when we say Berchas HaTorah every day in the morning, that is a bracha derabanan. That is on each and every individual's private learning. But every day in the morning, Sheni, Chamishi, Shabbos, when we read the Sefer Torah berabim, and that is always Talmud Torah derabim, that is why we say once again Berchas HaTorah, because that is the Ikra Mitzvah d'oraisa. That is based on the Yerushalmi. According to the Bavli, Berchas HaTorah and HaTorah even biyochid. So that explanation would not be valid, but this is a tekonomy achedes that Chazal or metakan on the mitzvah of Kriyas HaTorah. It is the same bracha, but this is on Talmud Torah of the individual, and this is on Kriyas HaTorah. So if we assume that Krias HaTorah is a mitzvah HaTzibur, it would make even more sense, because the bracha of Brichas HaTorah that we say in Krias HaTorah is a bracha for the tzibur and not only for the individual. So today we discussed the mitzvah of Brichas HaTorah, and that is very important because it's a mitzvah that we are mekayim on a steady basis. And the posik, which all this starts, is in this week's parsha, Vayechu shloisha yomim beli mayim, and the explanation of Chazal is they went 3 days without Torah, and that cannot be. How could you go 3 days without Torah? And to respond to the Prima Godim's question, we explained 3 days without Talmud Torah the Rabbim. That is something which is inconceivable. How could Klal Yisrael exist 3 days without Talmud Torah the Rabbim? And this was before Torah was given. We still didn't have the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And it still was so important to Moshe Rabbeinu and to Nevi'im Shebeineim to learn Torah. And according to the Bach, even before we had the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, we had the mitzvah of Krias HaTorah. It just stresses the importance and the centrality of Talmud Torah in the life of the people. We cannot go 3 days without Talmud Torah and without Talmud Torah the Rabbim. And what happened? What transpired? V'yasa Moshe es Yisrael miyam suf, v'yetzu al midbar shur, v'yelchu shloishes yomim b'midbar v'lo yimatzu mayim. V'yavoyu miroso, v'lo yochlu ishtes mayim yemoro ki morem heim. When they finally found water, it was bitter. It wasn't ra'ui l'shtia, al kein korosh ha'mayimoro. Vayaloinu ho'am al Moshe leimor ma'anishta. We're dying from thirst. V'yitzek al Hashem, v'yoreu Hashem eitz, v'yashlech el hamayim, v'yimtiku hamayim, sham sam lechoiku mishvat v'sham nisohi. Kodesh Baruch Hu shows Moshe wood. He throws the wood into the water, and the water becomes sweet. Chassam Sofer in his droshes explains, Mayim is Torah. Hoikol som alachila Mayim. Bavakami Yuzayin and many other sources in Chazal say, Ein Mayim ela Torah. What is Eitz? Eitz is Machzikei Torah, the supporters of Torah. Eitz Chayim hi lamachazikim ba. So the Chassam Sofer says, the Kodesh Baruch Hu shows Moshe, there will come a time, it will transpire, there will be water, but there will be a lack of eitz. There will be lamda Torah, but there won't be tamchen diurais, there won't be tamchit Torah, there won't be eitz chaim ila machazikim bo, and that will be very bitter. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu shows Moshe Rabbeinu eitz. Mayim needs eitz. Emen kemach ein Torah. Without the support of the people that have the means to support Torah, it will be bitter. And whenever I quote this some Sofer, I say, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't tell him what to do with the eitz. V'yoreu Hashem eitz, v'yashlech el hamayim, v'yimteku hamayim. How did Moshe Rabbeinu know that that is what he's supposed to do? To put the eitz into the water. And maybe he was required to have a cup of water in his left hand and a piece of wood in his right hand. V'yoreu Hashem eitz. And I always say, to support Torah, you need to appreciate Torah. To appreciate Torah, you need to love Torah. To love Torah, you need to learn Torah. So the real Zevulans are the Zevulans that are also Yisachars. The real supporters of Torah are people that not only support Torah, but learn Torah. Only they have the capacity and the ability to understand the importance of Torah. If you don't learn Torah, if you don't enjoy Torah, if you don't partake in Masikas Torah, how would you know what Torah is and how important Torah is? So all the people I know that are really supporting Torah on the individual basis and on the basis of Klal Yisrael really are people that learn themselves. And I must say, Achenu shebemedina sayam. I know so many people in Chutz La'aretz who are successful business people and professionals, and they dedicate hours to learn every day. And many of them learn be'iyun, and they go over the daf once or twice or 3 times a day. We don't have enough of that in Eretz Yisrael, and it's regrettable. And Eretz Yisrael, if you're not in kollel, most of the people even kollel don't really learn in a serious way. So right here and now, I'm speaking to chutznikim, and I'm sure that all of you learn a lot of Torah. But we have so much to learn from Achenu Shemedina Siyam. So the level and the intensity of Omer Torah in Eretz Yisrael is unparalleled. But the level of learning from Balabatim and Chutz La'aretz is something so beautiful and so admirable, and I wish we would have more of that in Eretz Yisrael. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu shows Moshe Rabbeinu eitz, and that indicates that it is not enough to have lamdim. We need people to support Torah. So Mayim is Torah, eitz is machzikei Torah. And Moshe Rabbeinu understands the eitz needs to be b'toich hamayim. And he puts the eitz into the water. The Zvulans need to be a sochas as well. The Zvulans need to learn, and they need to be in the Beis HaMedrash. And it is only those that understand the importance and the beauty of Torah to appreciate Torah, and ultimately they will be the supporters of Torah. And that is the remez of what transpired when the water was bitter, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu shows Moshe eitz, and he understands v'yashlech el torch hamayim v'yimteku hamayim. So as we came out of Mitzrayim, before anything else, the first event the Torah tells us about, right after Shir HaSayam, this is the first posuk after Shir HaSayam, v'yechu shlosh yomim b'li mayim, and that was inconceivable and unacceptable. And then v'yashlech al hamayim v'yimteku hamayim. So right after Geulas Mitzrayim, the first thing we learn is the importance of Klal Yisrael. We cannot go 3 days without Torah. We cannot go 3 days without Talmud Torah Barabim. And that is why it's such a privilege to be Marbitz Torah Barabim. So we all together learn Torah Barabim. And it's a great endeavor and a great privilege. And I'm thankful to all my Talmidim to give me the ability and the possibility and the schus and the privilege to be Marbitz Torah Barabim. Koyet and Hashem v'koy Yosef. And in the schus of Talmud Torah Barabim, we should be zoicha b'kol b'yameinu torach hamei shamayim, and we should always be mevaseh b'soides toivos and Yeshuas v'nachamos, and we should be zoicha to see Pnei Mashiach Tzedkenu b'meiru v'yomeinu Amen.